Hey everybody, it's Steven from Asian Boss. With the whole world on standstill right now, the only solution we seem to have to flatten the curve on COVID-19 is social distancing. But what we desperately need is a vaccine. The problem is no one really seems to know how long it's going to take to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. As a matter of fact, the whole process of developing one remains such a mystery to so many people. So today we're here at the International Vaccine Institute located in Seoul, South Korea, to talk with its Director General, Dr. Jerome Kim. Dr. Kim is waiting for us as we speak, so let's go have your questions answered by this leading vaccine expert. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
My pleasure.
I'm sure you hear what's going on the news. Pretty much the entire world is under lockdown. This whole question of developing a vaccine is on a lot of people's minds. Could you just maybe tell us a little bit about your background and what you're currently doing?
I trained as a medical doctor and specializing in internal medicine and infectious diseases. After completing my training at Duke, I joined this program called at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. My first boss was a guy named Robert Redfield, who's now the head of the US CDC. And under him was a woman named Deborah Birx, who is now the White House coordinator for the pandemic response to COVID. And when I became eligible to retire, this job came up, and I thought, hey, this would be a really kind of interesting thing to work on things other than HIV. Many of the vaccines we work on are not as well funded as HIV, but they're equally important. And it was good training, I think, for all of us at IVI. Then working on a MERS vaccine became a priority for Korea. And now with COVID, with another coronavirus, we have the opportunity to work on another vaccine or a set of vaccines that might potentially protect against COVID infection.
So what is the International Vaccine Institute? How does it operate?
IVI is an international organization, like the United Nations or WHO. We actually have member states, and a number of those member states actually provide funding to IVI. That would include the governments of Korea, India, and Sweden, and soon, we think, the government of Finland. Our mission, which has been the same mission since 1997 when IVI was founded, was to discover, develop, and deliver safe, effective, and affordable vaccines for global health. Our focus is on diseases that start in developing countries for which no vaccine solution exists, developing a vaccine, getting it through testing, getting it approved, getting it made in sufficient quantities to be able to impact the disease that we're interested in.
Did you guys anticipate anything like COVID-19 striking?
SARS-1, the original SARS in 2002, was a much more severe disease, actually had a very high transmission rate. The nice thing about SARS-1, if there was anything that was going to be nice about an epidemic outbreak, is that the people who were sick were the people who transmitted. So if you put them in isolation, you could protect other people. The problem with the second SARS outbreak, the COVID-19 outbreak, is, as you know, 80% of people have minimal symptoms. And those people are the people who are going out and spreading the disease to others. For a long time, those of us who do vaccines and are worried about outbreak diseases have been saying that, the World Bank estimated that we would spend, $6 trillion on outbreaks in the 21st century. And just this outbreak probably takes us pretty close to that. I think that scientists have known for a while that these coronaviruses like SARS, MERS, and COVID actually jump back and forth between humans and animals.
Yes.
The transmissibility issue was very important. I mean, it's as infectious as SARS. It's 10 times more infectious than flu. It's also 10 times more deadly than flu.
Right.
And that's what makes it a particularly potent combination of infectivity and virulence. And could there be another one? Possibly, but when will it happen? I don't think anyone has the crystal ball on that.
Unless you're in the field, I don't think people actually understand what is a vaccine and why is it important.
Disease protects against disease. So if you got smallpox through variolation, you are protected against smallpox. So what a vaccine actually does is it mimics the disease.
I see.
It takes a part of the virus or the bacterium, and often we stick it under the skin or we inject it into a muscle or we give it orally, but it trains your body's defensive system. So the body is defended by something called the immune system. And the immune system, in a way, is like an army, like a defense force.
Right.
And like every army, it benefits from practice. And what you're doing when you're vaccinating, you introduce a small piece of the virus or a part of the bacterium or a heat-killed germ, and the body sees it and says, oh, this isn't normal, this doesn't belong here, let's attack it. Let's make sure this doesn't cause a problem. And so the body puts together a response. It makes proteins that fight infection. With a virus, these proteins often neutralize the virus, and those proteins are called antibodies. They're made by a particular kind of immune cell called a B cell. At the same time, the body's making, we call them killer cells and helper cells, and those fall under the T cell category. So as the body's making these cells, the killer T cells are able to attack cells that have been infected by the virus, or the helper cells. Basically, they're kind of like the source of information and communication in the immune system. So your helper cells tell the B cells, make antibody. The helper cells help the killer cells by giving them the right kinds of signals to go ahead and mount a full attack against the virus.
So they're all part of like a white blood cell, is that?
They're all white blood cells, right? And the white blood cells defend you against infection. They're not the only white blood cells, because there are some white blood cells that aren't specific to particular pathogens, but they exist primarily to defend you generally against infection. They're like the fence on the outside of a camp, whereas inside you have the soldiers, the cells that are trained specifically to fight against this virus or that bacterium. And it's to the point where, you know, some of these cells will not react. So if you have a B cell that is specific for smallpox or COVID-19, and you come in with a completely different virus, a virus for rotavirus or respiratory syncytial virus, that B cell is going to say nothing, won't react. It really is highly specific for the pathogen that induced it. And actually, that's a good thing, because you don't want your B cells, just cranking out antibodies unless
fighting
you need
everything. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what you want is something that is really directed exactly at the pathogen. If we used a whole killed virus, it would be the entire virus. The outer coat, which has 3 or 4 proteins, the inner coat, which has usually a mixture of different proteins as well. Often with a vaccine, we can actually focus the body's defensive response on the 1 or 2 things that are the most important. And so, unlike a natural infection where your body's responding to everything in the virus, with a vaccine, we can actually tell the body, you don't need to respond to everything. Respond to this, and that will kill it. So in a way, the vaccine allows the body to be smart about what to attack.
And you can control that dosage?
Actually, you can control it by how much of the vaccine you give. In fact, one of the things you do when you're testing is you increase the dose to see what the best dose is that induces the best response. Sometimes you want the response to occur after the first dose. You may give slightly more. And we know this for several vaccines. You have to space out the doses in order to get the maximal response and a response that will last a long time. So when you're developing a vaccine, sometimes you're interested in a lot up front very quickly after the first dose. Sometimes you're waiting for the immune system to get to be appropriately reminded. So you give 1 dose, and then you give a booster dose, and then you give another dose. And that actually allows the defensive response to become better. The more times your body's immune system is exposed to a pathogen, to a germ, the better and faster and bigger the responses get. So that when a child gets 3 vaccines, every time they get a booster, the response goes higher and comes up faster and is much more specific. This is just the way the body has adapted to living in a world full of germs. We're lucky that we have this specific immune response. We call it the adaptive immune response.
Why does a vaccine take so long to develop?
So, right, under normal circumstances, with a standard pathogen that we're interested in developing a vaccine against, it could take 5 to 10 years. And that's pretty standard. If you look at the vaccines, sometimes they're 4, sometimes 6, and sometimes 10 or more. I mean, we've been working on an HIV vaccine without one.
So why do we not have HIV vaccine if so many smart people have been working on this for a decade?
That actually is the $1 million question. So, and this gets to why we think also that a COVID vaccine may be more possible. So remember I was talking about how after you've gotten an infection, you're protected. That's because, so say you develop COVID you acquire COVID-19 from somebody who's coughing. As your body is mounting that response, it's making the infection-fighting proteins called antibodies. It's developing the killer cells. And that combination of antibody and cells drives the virus out of the body, gets rid of it. The second part of it is that who's protecting the body? Why is the body immune to a second infection? Well, it's because these infection-fighting proteins and killer cells are there, and they're ready, and they're waiting. And if they ever see COVID again, they immediately, significantly increase the number of antibodies and cells, and they keep the virus at bay. So knowing that makes it much more likely that we can develop a vaccine. The problem with HIV is that it doesn't behave that way. With HIV, you can be infected with HIV, but you can be infected again. So we know that you can be, we say, super infected. So if you are completely controlled on drugs, right? So with HIV, we can treat people and eliminate the virus to undetectable. If you happen to have sex with someone who has a resistant virus, you can acquire that resistant virus, and it could take over. So superinfection, as we call it, the lack of protective, durable immune responses in an HIV-infected person is one of the reasons it's so difficult to develop a vaccine. One of the T cells helps everything. It's like the controlling, the communications center for the immune system. HIV attacks that cell and kills it. That is the target cell for HIV. So now all of a sudden your immune system is without an effective way to communicate to the B cells and to the killer cells. The other thing is that the virus, the HIV virus itself, has involved a whole series of protective mechanisms. It mutates itself very, very frequently. So it changes the proteins on the surface. So in an HIV-infected person, you can have billions of slightly different viruses in your blood.
Wow.
I mean, my lab, when I was still in the Army, used to sequence these viruses. And, we could sequence 1,000 very easily. And they're all different.
COVID-19 is not like that.
So we think it's still one of the unanswered questions, but the belief is, and you see this manifested actually now in everyone's belief that if they expose themselves to COVID, they might become immune and therefore they can go to work. We think that COVID-19 infection is protective against future infection. So it gives you immunity against reinfection.
That's what we heard as well from Dr. Fauci as well as Professor Kim. So far, they had a lot of reactivated cases or relapses, right, but they haven't seen any case of reinfection.
Right.
Is that correct?
So the problem is that it's difficult to tell. One of them is, I think, that the tests are not sensitive enough. So,
right,
you have you're recovering from the virus infection, and the amount of virus in your blood is decreasing, and the amount of virus in your throat, the places that they're swabbing, is decreasing. And finally, you reach a level of virus where the test can no longer pick it up, but it's still there.
We heard that that's around below 3,000
right.
Cells.
It's actually, I'm not sure that we know the count, especially on the throat,
right,
where that level of sensitivity is. But with HIV, for instance, when we first started measuring the virus in the blood, the lowest we could go was 1,000 per cc of blood. And then it was 400, and now it's 50, and it's going below that soon. So if you were negative at 1,000, it didn't mean that you were negative. It just meant you were below the level of detection. So one of the potential explanations is, these kits were rushed out. I mean, they're really good kits. I mean, their sensitivity and specificity of the kits is really remarkable, considering how quickly they were made and tested and, then reviewed and then approved by the regulatory authorities. The second part is, could it be reactivation? So I think increasingly in the last 2 weeks we've been learning that COVID-19 doesn't only attack the lungs, it attacks the kidneys, it can attack the brain, it attacks the heart.
Inflammation, you mean?
Inflammation, right. And could the virus be present in those sites even after we can no longer detect it in the nasal swabs? And that's possible too, and I think that's the reservoirs, the reemergence of disease. And then there's the possibility of reinfection, and I think, we all think that that's the least likely, because what you should see is that if a person is, quote, reinfected, the person who infected or reinfected him should be transmitting to others. And we're not seeing those clusters being reported, so that makes it somewhat less likely. But again, this is something that really has to be understood better.
How much would you say it costs to develop a vaccine in general?
Usually, if you asked GSK or Merck, they would tell you $500 million for an easy vaccine, $1 billion to $2 billion for a difficult vaccine. And in part that's related to the 5 to 10 year time frame, right? So you start in the laboratory, you develop something you think might be a vaccine, you might actually develop several of them, and then you test them in animals. And again, that takes time, right? Because you have to make the vaccine, then you have to test it. You are experimenting to see if you're at the right dose, and you're checking the animal to make sure it doesn't get sick from receiving the vaccine. All that can take years because you're optimizing it in the laboratory, and then it's transitioned to the point where we manufacture it a particular way with very high attention to quality, because then it jumps from being in animals, being tested in mice and rabbits, to being tested in humans. And the level of quality that's necessary in order for it to be tested in humans is very different. The initial test in humans is we call phase 1.
How many phases are there?
There are 3 phases.
Phases.
Actually, there's a 4th phase also, but the true testing phases are 1, 2, and 3. The first phase is really, we say, safety and immunogenicity. Safety is what it sounds like. We don't know that this brand new vaccine is safe. So we inject it into people, usually not very quickly. I mean, we inject a number of people, then wait, and then we increase the number or increase the dose or change the dosage. Typically less than 50 people are involved. Because really it's to make sure it's safe and to make sure that the vaccine generates at least a hint of the right immune responses. Phase 2 is actually much larger, often hundreds of volunteers. And in phase 2 you're really looking to see, does the vaccine actually generate what we are hoping to see? The right antibodies, the infection-fighting proteins, the right types of cells, the killer cells and the helper cells. And often we're experimenting, should we give 2 doses 1 month apart, or can we give 1 dose and then wait 6 months? And you're doing that, and you also then, you're going to go into the target population. So for one of our vaccines that's for children, we say age de-escalating, so we'd start in adults, then move to teenagers, and then into children. And so you really try to determine in the target population, does this work? And so now you're involving hundreds of people, and you can see now the costs are starting to build. At the same time, the company has to learn how to make the vaccine, because it's not just taking a vaccine that worked in a test tube and that you could grow in a 500 ml flask. I mean, now they're thinking, now we're going to have to put this in a 1,000-liter reactor. And so how are we going to get from the thing that's on your tabletop to something that's this giant stainless steel Dewar thermos bottle with that is growing millions or billions of cells or virus particles per ml. Then you collect the data, right? So now you have hundreds of samples from these volunteers. You're analyzing the safety data, which is all in computers. And then you're trying to decide, well, do I make a decision to go for to test this vaccine to see if it works? Or are we going to go back a step and reformulate it, or give a larger dose, or increase the number of doses from 2 to 3? So all of this is going on, as the company is developing the vaccine, and every time you're doing that, you're adding costs.
So what's the conversion rate like? Do all the trials end up making it to phase 3, or?
No, and so 93% of trials fail sometime between the animal study and the final approval of the vaccine for marketing. The number that fail is greatest in the animal stage. So the company just decides, no, this is not worth doing. And then in phase 1, there's further dropout, because then the company says, well, this is tougher than we thought. And then by phase 2, the company is really interested, and they're really looking at those responses in the target populations. And if you can't induce the right response, you're at the maximum dose, and you don't think that the pediatric schedule would tolerate 4th dose of vaccine. The companies will go, well, do we really want to do this? Or is there something we can do to make it better? And then by the time you get to phase 3, you are pretty certain that the vaccine is going to work. Because a company doesn't want to invest in a trial that involves thousands of people for a vaccine that they're really not sure will work.
Because there has to be financial incentive for them as well.
Right, and then so that's the biggest cost, but also the biggest gain if you succeed in phase 3, which looks at efficacy and safety. So it's looking to see that the vaccine protects against infection or disease, or both. Because if you do, and you know that it's 70% or 80% efficacious, then you put together this entire pack of data. It's about 100,000 pages in the old style, like several containers full of papers. Take it to the Food and Drug Administration, and you say, this is our analysis of our data. We think the vaccine works, and we would like for you to approve it. And after a year, the FDA decides, okay, we agree, it works, it protects, it's ready. And they give you the approval, but that doesn't mean that people are going to use your vaccine. Then you often have to go to another group, which in the United States recommends vaccines. And it's similar. So if you're working with WHO, there's a WHO group called SAGE, the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts in Immunization. And SAGE recommends the vaccine, because you can imagine many countries don't have enough vaccine experts to compose something like the SAGE or like the ACIP in the United States. And so they depend on the WHO's recommendation in order to consider the vaccine for uptake into their program. So now you have the recommendation to use it, and you also now have to make sure that you have enough vaccine. So typically, as a vaccine is entering phase 3, the companies are ramping up production, because as soon as it's approved, they want to be able to sell it. And that's why the process at that point is so efficient, and they want to make sure that they can manufacture it for as low a price as possible, because that, again, allows them to maximize the benefit to the company. And that would be how it works under normal circumstances. And you can see, phase 3 might take 2 years, because it's, several thousand people. Like the trial that we did in Thailand was 16,000 people.
Wow.
The trial that the Army did in Thailand for hepatitis A vaccine was 40,000. So some of these trials are very big and complex and expensive. So, and then, the company is ready to sell it. For COVID, Dr. Fauci says 12 to 18 months to the proof that the vaccine works. Because you can see now we're in phase 1. By midsummer, the earliest starters will probably be considering moving into phase 2. And so phase 1 at this point won't even be over. They'll be looking at the initial, is it safe? Are we seeing responses? And if they are, then they'll probably move into phase 2, and phase 2 will have different doses or different dosing schedules in the target population. Now you're thinking several hundred people or hundreds of people. And if things are looking good, and again, you're not going for a population that's necessarily at high risk, because you want to make sure, again, that safety, that you're getting the right immune responses before you take it forward to challenge, in a population that is at risk for infection. Final phase, phase 3, has to be done in a population that is at risk for the disease.
Right.
Right. So you wouldn't necessarily, for instance, do an HIV vaccine in a population that had zero risk for HIV. And so you'd have to find a part of the world that had has significant problems with COVID infection.
So Korea is pretty under control.
Right, and so it would be difficult to do phase 3 testing in Korea.
Right.
So you'd have to look somewhere else in the world that's having a major COVID outbreak. So somewhere in Europe or
States.
In the States or South America. And then, hopefully, at the end of 12 to 18 months, the study could get stopped earlier if the vaccine is really, really working well. Or it could go all the way to its conclusion, and we will need to look at what we call the unblinding. So typically when you do a vaccine study, a certain group of people gets vaccine and another group gets placebo, which is an inactive substance. And at some point you have to be able to look and say, yeah, the people who got vaccine are protected. The people who didn't get vaccine have infection at a certain rate, and this means the vaccine protects. Hopefully that will happen within the 12 to 18 month window.
How optimistic are you about that timeline?
So right now these vaccines have data in animals.
What kind of animals, can I ask?
So typically they start in mice. They may do, it depends on the company, they may do hamsters. I think many of the companies are planning to do testing in monkeys. Because again, as you move up, as you go from mice to rabbits to monkeys, you get closer and closer to what the actual responses might be in humans. People have seen vaccines look great in mice,
right,
and completely fail in humans. The CEPI has chosen technologies that are rapid, that we can very rapidly develop vaccines and bring them to testing in humans. Many of them have been used so safely in human populations that the US FDA and the EMA and actually the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety will give them expedited review. So they don't actually need one of the toxicology studies in animals, because they've already been in humans and they look pretty safe. Or they look safe. And so the regulatory agencies are saying that's not necessary. You can go directly into humans because this is an emergency.
Yeah.
And so that's how, I guess from the initial announcement of COVID-19 in January, till the first CEPI Awards, which is the first week in February, to the first dose in humans. It was Moderna, an RNA company based in the United States, March 17th, so roughly 2 months. And Inovio, which is another American company that makes a DNA vaccine, was a month later. They're trying to expedite this. They're trying to show that this works, because the proof that it works, or the proof, a suggestion that it works, could potentially create a drive to accelerate the testing even faster.
Are we on track then at this pace to be able to develop something and get something done in 18 months?
We would look at the phase 1 and phase 2 data from the human trials, and we look at it and say, this vaccine just doesn't give you the right responses. The responses are too low, or they only come up after the second dose, which is a month after the first dose, and it's still too low. So there could be some fine-tuning. So you wouldn't go back to start. You would go back and well, maybe we have to design an experiment where we give them twice as much vaccine.
Right.
There could be something called a safety signal. And we don't think so, because these vaccines have been tested in humans before, similar vaccines, and they haven't given us safety signals before. What if you got information from the animal study that it didn't protect the animals? It didn't protect the monkeys against infection. Would that make you reconsider if you had protective responses, immune responses to the vaccine that were already on the low side? So again, those are the kinds of things that you would look at going from phase 2 to phase 3. The other part is that, maybe coming near late fall, or let's say October, November timeframe, you might have 1, 2, or 3 vaccines that actually have data from phase 2. Do you want to go forward with all 3? Or all of the vaccines? Or do you want to down select and pick only the ones you think might be best? And that's a decision that funders have to help make. I mean, they'll be informed by scientists and probably a series of consultations around, is this appropriate to take forward? Do we go forward with all of them, or just the one that we think is the best?
Who makes that decision, though?
So with CEPI and groups like CEPI, there are scientific advisory groups that CEPI convenes that will help them make a decision. I'm sure the World Health Organization will also be involved in some of the decision making and the review of the data. And then organizations that do this all the time, like the Gates Foundation or the National Institute of Health, BARDA in the United States, all will have their own groups of people who are helping to try to decide what to do and how to move something forward. If we're lucky, we can test more than one thing, because as you know, there is a risk of failure with any one approach.
Right.
And could it be a vaccine from the United States, or a vaccine from Europe, or a vaccine from China or Korea? We don't know at this point.
Do you know which country is the most ahead in terms of development?
So with CEPI funding, CEPI funded a European company, CureVac, 2 American companies, Inovio and Moderna, and an Australian university, the University of Queensland. And the Queensland approach is actually different, because unlike the DNA and RNA approaches from the other companies, they're looking at a protein. And proteins are interesting because, they're much more like a traditional vaccine. There are protein vaccines that have been licensed. There have been so far no DNA or RNA vaccines that have been licensed. Who knows who's ahead at this point? We know that 5 or 4 groups have started trials in humans, and we don't know the data yet. So, and really it's the first round of data that will be the most helpful.
Yeah. Let's say everything goes according to plan and we just roll this thing out smoothly, but I think distribution is a completely different question. So what people are basically wondering is that, who's going to get it? When is it going to be my turn, basically?
Right. No, that's actually probably a question, too, that we need to discuss now. Good news is that at least some of the vaccines are funded by an international collaboration of a partnership of countries and philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. So that would be the CEPI-funded vaccines, and there are 8 of them now.
Right.
In order to get funding from CEPI, you have to sign a global access agreement. So you kind of agree to make the vaccine available at a certain cost that is not going to be excessive, that will be fair to developing countries. The other part is that we know that the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, already has a plan that if there's a successful vaccine, that there will be a mechanism for the poorest countries in this world to get it either at cost or at no cost from Gavi, which runs a stockpile. The question that is then going to be asked is, so when does Gavi get its stockpile? Does the stockpile start, once the United States gets its, share of the vaccine, or is this something that, we all commit to? And I think within CEPI, they have a mechanism, but they should be talking about how to, fairly distribute vaccine. Who needs it first? Is it the healthcare providers?
Yes.
Or is it countries where the virus is killing, hundreds of thousands of people and has a lot of active ongoing cases? Or is it a country like Korea, which has largely controlled the outbreak, but still has 50 million people who've never seen it and, would be susceptible? So who gets the vaccine first? And that's a decision that has to be made when we're calm, and not a decision that should be made when we're reaching for the one one vaccine that works. Individual countries that fund efforts like China or the United States are probably going to require, as a part of the funding, that the vaccine that is made under funding from this country has a priority for providing vaccine to that country. I mean, that's the way organizations are. Luckily, CEPI has also funded most of the companies, so that there is going to be a time to discuss who gets how much and who gets vaccinated first. The World Health Organization is also getting involved, and so they're convening a group of people that includes CEPI and the countries and other organizations that develop vaccines to initiate the discussion around access and equity. And that is going to be a really critical issue a year and a half to 2 years from now.
There are a lot of flu vaccines. As a matter of fact, I think we are advised that we need to get a flu shot every year.
Yes.
Does that mean it's like a new vaccine that's being developed every year?
Yes, so flu vaccines are kind of an exception, right? I mean, because every year the WHO determines the formula for flu vaccine for the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, because there are different viruses in circulation at different times in the northern and southern hemispheres. Sometimes they're the same,
right,
but often they're different. And the thing about flu vaccine is exactly that the strains change. And sometimes they change really dramatically, like H1N1 did, and then we get really worried because people don't have immunity. For the strains that are commonly found in any year to another year, there's a little bit of change in the influenza strain. So they change the vaccine slightly, or they may keep one component the same because it's the same strain that's circulating in multiple years. But by and large, the companies have adapted to a system where within a year, they can put the new components of the vaccine together and get it tested and approved by the regulatory agencies.
That's why it's much quicker, and it's
Right.
doesn't take 18 months or
Right.
longer.
Right, because you don't necessarily have to do all the individual testing and show that it works. The FDA or the EMA will license it based on the immune responses, and that actually is really helpful. We can't do that with COVID because we don't know what immune responses protect. With influenza, we're fairly certain we know which ones protect and correlate with protection.
So I know you talked about the whole concept of booster. Do you think that even if we end up developing some sort of a vaccine for COVID-19, we should continue to get it every year, or is it just pretty much one and done?
Okay. So with influenza, we get vaccinated every year. Though at least in the United States, there's a recommendation for nearly universal vaccination yearly. It's not the same in many other countries, and that's because the composition of the flu vaccine changes every year. For COVID-19, it's one of the things we don't know. We will only know how effective the vaccine is, how large the immune response is, and how long it will last after we've given the vaccine. So there's no way to know before testing how long the vaccine will last. So it might be that you will need a booster, especially if COVID-19 persists and is circulating around the world. We also don't know if that happens, if it becomes endemic, a chronic virus, a virus that's present and comes and goes, whether the virus will change under pressure from the human immune system or in order to get a particular advantage.
Oh, so they can mutate and just, oh man.
So but the good news for now, and there's very little good news about COVID-19, but the good news is, they've sequenced thousands of COVID viruses. Well, compared to the millions of infections, that's not a lot. And in that 30,000 base pair genome, they found 11 mutations. So the 11 mutations is actually fairly low. It's tenfold lower than flu.
Oh, okay, that's good.
And it's much, much lower than HIV.
Right.
So, again, the bad news is that the COVID is spreading around the world. The one potentially good news is that it doesn't seem to be changing that much, so that we hope that the immune responses that defeat strain A will defeat strain B.
Another thing I hear about is this thing called herd immunity. You just let people get it, as opposed to, do we need to get a vaccine?
Herd immunity, though, the issue is really, the severity of this disease. And it isn't actually only the deaths, although, you can imagine in a country of 350 million people, 2% mortality rate is
a lot.
Is 7 million. And that would be unheard of in a modern, wealthy, high-income country, well-resourced society. I mean, that would probably be considered unacceptable. Remember that between 10 and 20% of people get hospitalized. It's that. I mean, all of a sudden now you're looking at a significant proportion of 350 million people needing hospitalization over the course of 3 months, and we don't have the hospital beds, which means that people would be left at home the way they were in some places where there wasn't appropriate, there wasn't hospital space, and people would die at home. There's some thought that the healthcare system, as stressed as it is, still provides a better option for people who are sick than being left at home on your own to fend for yourself.
Yeah.
And so it's not only the deaths.
Is there any scientific basis for saying that this could cause any side effects? Are there side effects, if any?
Vaccines are given to healthy people to keep them healthy. So the bar for safety is very high. It has to be. When we look at the safety profile for modern vaccines, I mean, really we have a remarkable set of tools for public health. We give these vaccines to billions of people around the world, and they do a remarkable job in preventing infection and death. When you're doing the initial stage of vaccine testing, remember phase 1 is all about safety.
Yeah.
In phase 2 and phase 3, you're continuing to collect safety information, and then after phase 3, we really are obligated to continue to follow people over time in order to make sure that if you got the vaccine and you're protected, that after 2 or 3 years, if that protection wanes, could that make you even more susceptible to infection? As you're doing development, you really want to make sure that you ensure that people who are participants in the trials don't suffer as a result of their participation. So that's a part of the long-term safety follow-up. And then afterwards, once a vaccine is approved, and typically there are what we call phase 4 studies, which are for an already approved vaccine, that look at a much greater extent at how the vaccine works in real life. It's one thing to do it in an experiment where you have some people get vaccines, some people don't. Yeah. That's very controlled. But when you give enough people in a population that vaccine, so when roughly 50% of the population is vaccinated, you get protective effectiveness of 80%.
Wow.
And that's actually the benefit. That's the herd immunity kicking in.
Right.
So again, it depends, and the real-world data, we hope, will be even better than the experimental data, but that's something that we have to monitor, and at the same time, we have to monitor for safety in a much greater number of people. So the US CDC monitors the safety of all vaccines used in the United States. The World Health Organization is helping countries around the world to set up these long-term vaccine and adverse event reporting systems that will allow them to look at longer-term safety consequences from vaccines as vaccines are rolled out into populations. So again, I need to emphasize that vaccines should be safe.
We just feel that people are just being bombarded with so much misinformation. Something's clearly not getting through. All this scientific facts and findings and research and study, why are they not getting through to the people?
Scientists are difficult to listen to, and doctors. And we know that something works. We don't necessarily have time to explain it. A lot of people don't necessarily oppose vaccines, but they've heard that there might be side effects, or they've talked to someone who has a child that has autism, and who strongly believes that the vaccine caused it, which is not the case. And they go onto the internet, and the first things that come up when you Google something are the messages that are opposed to vaccination. And then they go to the doctor, and the doctor doesn't have much time to, well, you don't want it? Well, in our state, it's not necessary for you to get it. If the parent feels that you don't need it, you sure you don't need it? And then they leave. This is a process of engaging with the family, with the parents, explaining why vaccines work and how safe they are. And, it requires time. And most people want to know the answer. You can find lots of answers on the internet, and you have to be able to screen them. I mean, that's actually maybe one of the problems during COVID. I'll go to an interview and someone will say, so the New York Times has just shown or just published that this is true. What do you think? And I'll say, that I don't remember reading that in the New England Journal. It's a report now that's loaded onto a preprint server.
Yeah.
It hasn't been reviewed.
Yeah.
It hasn't been accepted by a journal. But you know, the filter, which was normally the editors at the journal and the reviewers of the paper, have been removed, and we're actually looking at things before they've actually had a true scientific review. And that makes it more difficult. But how does the average person interpret that? I mean, you see a report from France that hydroxychloroquine significantly improved outcomes, and you read the report and you think, this was not done, there wasn't a control group, they had mild infection, how do we know that it actually works? Well, then someone like Dr. Fauci says, well, we do a trial. We compare hydroxychloroquine to standard of care. And if the hydroxychloroquine is working, then people will come off the ventilators sooner, the amount of virus in their throat swabs will decrease, or if we give it to people with mild disease, they won't progress to being on a ventilator. And then if you can show that compared to doing nothing, then it works. But unfortunately, we jumped to the conclusion that it worked. And really what we need is a balanced scientific review of this and actually a test designed to answer the question, does it work?
What is your biggest challenge at the moment?
I think our biggest challenge is, we want to do more. And, even with the staff we have, it's getting increasingly difficult. And, a lot of it is about funding. The Korean government recognizes this because they've recently increased funding for vaccines. As long as there's COVID somewhere in this world, and there will be for, another 2 years at least, probably.
So you don't see this going away?
It's not going to disappear. It's with us.
Wow. That's something, I'm actually hearing that for the first time.
We have to learn to live with the new normal. Is the new normal having a situation where a certain amount of social interaction can occur around the idea that, the people who are going to places that would potentially be at higher risk for acquiring infection and bringing it back are protected? And it's spreading around the world, and I mean, like the Spanish flu, it could come around again. And remember, in Korea, there weren't that many people infected. I mean, a lot of people in quarantine, not many infected. That means that almost all Koreans could be infected. So it would only take, 1 or 2 new cases that are missed for whatever reason, and we could have a new daegu. And so that's why a vaccine is so important.
Hopefully next time we see you, you have more update or better news, more positive news.
Yeah, I think we're all hoping for that. We're working as hard as we can and as fast as we can. And, if there were new vaccines that we could test, we'd be happy to do that. If there were new opportunities to bring people into contact or support for CEPI, we'd be happy to do that too. And in the meantime, I think, people still have to protect themselves and protect others. So, the keeping a mask on, keeping an appropriate distance away from people, even though now some of the restrictions are being eased, we still have to be careful. Hygiene is going to be important and will continue to be important. It's very important for people to know the science, to understand COVID and not to fear it, to be able to work with governments in order to control COVID-19 infection, and to work with us to help develop a vaccine as quickly as possible.